Welcome everyone to this week's video. Today we are on Fish Friday number 203 and we have a good one for you today. Today's fish is unfortunately kind of on the exact opposite side of the fish that we talked about last week. This fish is definitely in trouble and I do worry about its future, but hopefully I will be worried for nothing. Today's fish that we're going to be talking about is, bam, the Rio Grande Silvery Minnow. Now, the Rio Grande Silvery Minnow, or scientific name Hibognathus amorus, again, that's Hibognathus amorus, it is part of the family Cyprinidae, which is the family of true minnows. Now, we can go all in sorts of discussions on Cyprinidae, Leuciscidae. I am under the impression that everything is still Cyprinidae, and this is the true minnow and carp family. So I'm sticking to it until I am 100% shown otherwise. Now, the genus Hibognathus are known as the silvery minnows for, kind of obvious, let's say, reasons. There are certain characteristics that I don't necessarily want to get into, but they're a very, very neat group of fish. So please go look at some of these other Hibognathus species, and I believe all of them are in trouble. All of them. But we're talking about the Rio Grande Silvery Minnow. Now, the Rio Grande Silvery Minnow, the historic range of this minnow was the Rio Grande and Pecos rivers in New Mexico and Texas all the way down to Gulf of Mexico. That's what the historic range is. But unfortunately, the Rio Grande Silvery Minnow is actually the last of 5 species that operated with the same life histories. Now, when scientists talk about life histories, there's a lot that goes into it. It's a broad term that basically this is what this species does to survive. This is what it eats. This is what it breeds as. This is how it reproduces, yada yada. Now, a lot of Cyprinidaes have interesting characteristics, and one of the diagnostic characteristics, I don't want to call it a diagnostic characteristic. One of the characteristics is that a lot of Cyprinidaes are what are known as pelagic spawners, meaning that when they spawn, their eggs get released into the current and they travel downstream, and that is how this species propagates new areas. And in the Rio Grande Basin, the Rio Grande Silvery Minnow is the last one that still exists in the Rio Grande. It is one of the most endangered fish in North America, and we've talked about what I considered one of the most endangered fish in the entire world, the desert hole pupfish. This fish is definitely, it's doing better, and there's a lot of efforts going in to save it, but it's still pretty scary. They were actually classified as endangered in the US by Fish and Wildlife in 1994. They're actually found less than 5% of their native range. Historically, it was found, like I said, all of the Rio Grande, the Pecos rivers down to the North Met. Now it can only be found, and I actually have a map here. It can only be found in the Rio Grande at Cochiti Dam, New Mexico, which is, Cochiti Lake, down to Elephant Butte Reservoir. And just based on kind of how I think, it probably doesn't get into the actual main stem. It might be in the smaller ones, but I do not believe it's actually in the Butte Reservoir itself, meaning that it's there. But as you can see here, you can drive basically the entirety of that stretch, 200 miles. So this fish went from all of this river system and the Pecos River system to this stretch. And that is concerning. It certainly is. Less than 5% of their natural habitat, which is so concerning. And the reason for that is because the Rio Grande River system has gone through very, very drastic changes through damming or sediment transportation, sedimentation. A lot of these, the entire hydrologic cycle of the Rio Grande system has been drastically altered. And unfortunately, that has caused a huge decline in native species in that area. And these fish in particular like larger streams with very slow to moderate current flowing over silt and sand substrates. They usually occupy streams where water depths are less than 15, 16 inches, which I believe is 36 centimeters, something like that, with a very low to moderate velocity. Which means that, the entirety of the Rio Grande, they like very small sections, which creates even more problematic, especially considering that slow to moderate current flowing means that that's usually a depositional area. So there can be a lot of sedimentation happening that makes the river even shallower. And when rivers get to a certain point, they become too shallow to actually support life, just based on the heat, especially in New Mexico, where this heat could actually become, be pretty prolific. Now, these habitats are going to be in like eddies, debris piles, pools, backwaters, canals, around submerged vegetation. Basically, anywhere in the river that they can find slower moving water, that's where they're going to want to sort of live and hang. Now, it is a small fish. You can see here, this is a person holding one in their hand. It's a small fish, max of like 9 centimeters, which is around 3.5 inches in length. But it is a stouter minnow. It's not excessively streamlined. It's got this very, very thick body, a pretty decently noticeable lateral line, kind of this grayish back, greenish yellow back, cream white below, but it is silver. It is a silvery minnow. There's no way to deny it. It's got a bit of an overbite, large eyes. Hibonathus can actually cause a lot of problems for people trying to ID them if they're not familiar with this. But once you see them, you kind of get an eye for them, and you can be like, oh yeah, that's a Hibonathus, or that's not a Hibonathus. But this overbite, I like that characteristic. A slightly subterminal mouth, or terminal mouth with an overbite. I mean, very, very silver and very, very little coloration. Cylindrical, it's not very laterally compressed. In terms of what it eats, it has this, it's classified as more omnivorous, because they do eat a lot of algae and diatoms. They're using that mouth to sort of scrape algae off, but in the process of that, they are going to get these benthic macroinvertebrates. So basically, if they find an insect while they're trying to look for algae, they will eat an insect if they can believe they can get it in their mouth. So it's actually pretty neat. But it's primarily more of an algae eating fish, almost herbivorous. That's my opinion. That's probably where it gets like 80% of its nutrients, but they supplement it with those benthic macroinvertebrates. Now, the Rio Grande silvery minnow, in terms of its spawning, I talked about how they're a pelagic spawner, and it's really associated with spring runoff and snow melt. So up in these mountainous streams, a lot of people that live up there know that in the springtime, all the snow melts off, and it usually creates this sort of flood pulse downstream. And that's what triggers actually a lot of fish to spawn. That combined with increasing temperatures, there's a lot of spawning that happens. They spawn, then they stop spawning for about 10 minutes, and they'll spawn again. There's usually these 10-minute intervals. And what happens is the males chase the females. Then when the females are ready to reproduce, they actually, the male will wrap around the females, and, basically the sperm and eggs are released together. They get fertilized, and they're semi-buoyant, meaning they just go out and they just drift. So it's, pelagic spawning is actually kind of neat in river systems. because you have to think about it. These fish go down and then they spend a lot of their life traveling slowly upstream. Because a lot of fish work their way from downstream to upstream when they can. So it's kind of neat how they just do that. And sometimes they get washed a little farther down, or sometimes it's a little slower, so they move a little farther up. It's kind of neat. And there's a publication that I'm going to include in the description of this video from the USGS about just a ton of information on the Rio Grande Silvery Minnow. So please go read it. It was such a good read. Really, really good. And what's another good thing about this is they actually hatch fairly quickly, between 24 and 50 hours of fertilization. And the larvae basically swim 3 to 4 days after hatching. So this fish goes from egg to larva, like fresh out of the female egg, to a larval fish, a fry, within a week. It's really bizarre, and they reach full maturity within a year, so they're actually a fairly short-lived species as well. Now, for the interesting fact we're going to end the video on is kind of in regards to this picture. This fish is in trouble. There is no denying it, but it is awesome to see how much effort and partnerships and things like that have gone in to save this minnow. There's so many efforts going in to recover, conserve, and protect the Rio Grande Silvery Minnow. Habitat restoration, population monitoring, egg collection, captive breeding programs, genetic studies, monitoring, rescue, and salvage. During the severe droughts of 2011, they would actually go out there and catch these fish that had been isolated in pools and take them somewhere safe so that they could survive until the water came back, making sure this species is doing as well as it can. Captive breeding and then releasing them into wild populations. It's a ton of things. And the thing I want to key on is the habitat restoration, because I don't think a lot of people understand how endangered species sort of work. So endangered species are used as like indicators of the habitat. Habitat is the big key on, and that is what allows animals to survive. And endangered species are used as indicators of those habitats. So we know that the Rio Grande has been severely degraded due to human influence. It's not an unknown factor. It is known that that is a big issue. Well, we want to restore it. We want to take it back. We want to make it better and support more biotic life. So what do we do? Well, let's look at the Rio Grande Silvery Minnow. It's it's only found in this section, and there's a lot of studies going on there. So if the Rio Grande Silvery Minnow is doing well, then that means that the habitat is being restored in a way that's beneficial. If it's not, and it's not based on, severe drought causing problems or things like that, it's a key that allows scientists and government officials and restoration people to see if their efforts are being wasted or if they're actually working fairly well. So that's where I was saying endangered species are used as indicators. The idea is to protect the habitat to support life for all animals. And if endangered species are used as sort of the indicator, if they're doing well, then everything else must be doing well as well. So that's really what I wanted to key on. It's the fact that I love how much effort is going to there, and to provide you all a little bit of information on why endangered species are used as the way they are, and why they're talked about in the way they are, and why one of the number one things that go into protecting endangered species is actually habitat restoration. Because the idea is not just to keep the species alive, because then we could just throw them in a bunch of aquariums and protect them forever and ever and ever. Like, captive breeding has shown that we can do that. The idea is to be able to make them wild and thrive in thriving populations in the wild. But thank you guys so much again. I really appreciate it. Hope to see you again. If you'd like to support the channel, please click the link down below. It is by no means expected, but very much appreciated. Please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. It is amazing to read these comments. Regardless, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and peace.